the individual behind the famous YouTube channel Outdoor Adventures, which has 1.6 million followers, recently embarked on an unsettling challenge that pushed both his own courage and his audience's nerves to the edge. He ventured into a remote location, famous for a cave that is rumored to be haunted. The adventure begins with Alex preparing for a 24-hour solo camping experience in the cave, which is surrounded by local legends and tales shared by Alex's friends, claiming the place has an eerie presence. Almost as soon as Alex steps inside the cave, he begins to feel as though he's being watched. Strange sounds surround him. So, quite a bit of time has passed, and I'm still sitting here. I've heard two really odd noises now. The first one, I swear, was the ladder I climbed down on, swinging. Now, I could be imagining it, but I could have sworn I heard the ladder moving. Then there's this other strange noise. I can't put my finger on what it is, but it's definitely not normal. I don't think it's bats, but who knows? Anyway, it's about 11 p.m. right now, so I'm gonna have some baked beans. As Alex settles in and begins eating, the odd feeling deepens. Suddenly, an inexplicable noise sends a chill down his spine. Oh my God, that sound. Did you hear that? Look at my arms. I've got full goosebumps. As the night goes on, the strange noises increase. He hears things that can't be explained away by the wind. Guys, I really hope you heard that chain move just now. I'm 100% sure it's the chain I used to climb in. It's definitely moving. But the wind can't do that. It's way too heavy for that. No wind is coming in here at all. For real. Oh my God. Please tell me you heard that. Despite his growing fear and the mounting strangeness, Alex decides to stay for the whole night. After a brief moment of considering leaving early, he chooses to endure, hoping to make it until morning. By dawn, he's visibly shaken. I just heard something again. Something that's not normal. I'm freaked out, honestly. That sound, it was weird. It's been around 2 hours since I last checked in with you guys, so it must be around 2 a.m. now. Good morning to you, it's finally morning. I've spent the whole night here, and those noises were the strangest I've ever heard. I'm not gonna lie, I had chills, but I'm still here, and I haven't been taken by a ghost or anything, so that's a good thing. The question remains, is this cave really haunted? Alex's experience seems to support the eerie legends about the place. Meanwhile, another YouTube channel called Nomadic Row usually shares videos about van life and the wonders of nature. But in December 2017, it took a turn toward the unsettling. In a video from that year, Rowe describes an unnerving encounter that occurred while he was car camping in a parking lot at around 1:30 a.m. A hooded figure started circling his vehicle, snapping photos of the license plate. The area where Rowe was parked was completely dark, making it unlikely that the man knew anyone was inside the vehicle. I think it was around 1:30 a.m. when I heard someone walking around my truck. If you've ever slept somewhere public and heard footsteps near your vehicle, you know it's a bit unsettling. Soon after, the guy pulls out his phone and starts taking pictures of the back of the truck. It seemed odd, especially at that time of night. The fear grows when the man starts to shine a flashlight inside the truck. Realizing that the stranger may not have known he was inside, Rowe decides to act. He bangs his fist against the inside of the truck to alert the man. You'll see here in a second that he comes back around and shines a flashlight into my camper shell. I bang on the window, and the guy immediately runs off. I guess he wasn't expecting that. While the man's intentions remain unclear, his odd behavior suggested something sinister, possibly even a carjacking attempt. Fortunately, Rowe's actions scared the man away, and he was able to sleep through the rest of the night without further incident. Shah, the daring adventurer behind the YouTube channel, often ventures into the hidden parts of the UK, sharing his solo camping journeys. His channel is a collection of beautiful landscapes and peaceful nights under the stars. But in February 2024, one of his trips took an unsettling turn. "I've parked by the side of the road, across from a clearing," he said. "After last week's encounter, I thought this week I'd head out to a more remote place to get some peace and quiet." On this particular adventure, Sean decided to leave his van by a road next to a dense forest. After a few hours of exploring, he returned to the van and later went for another walk. Once back, he settled into his van, preparing for a quiet night. He signed off his video as he always did. "All being well, I'll see you in the morning. Good night." But as he drifted into sleep, the real story was just beginning. Around 3 a.m., Sean was suddenly woken by the sound of a car pulling up nearby. Listening carefully, he heard footsteps circling his van. His heart raced as he realized someone was outside. Quietly, he pulled back the curtains to see what was happening. The mysterious visitors hurriedly got back into their car and drove off into the night. But that wasn't the end of it. The next morning, Sean went to check the outside of his van. When he tried to open the door, he found it was stuck. Confused and alarmed, he forced it open, only to be met with a disturbing sight. Someone had used heavy-duty zip ties to lock the doors, trapping him inside. "My door's stuck," he said, noticing the zip ties securing it. "Look at that." As Sean examined his van, he saw the back door had also been tampered with. His mind raced with possibilities. Were they trying to steal fuel? Or were these locals upset by his presence? Or perhaps they were just playing pranks. Despite the terrifying experience, Sean's adventurous spirit remained intact. "I'm not giving up on my travels," he said, his determination as strong as ever. Daring Wood, also called the Screaming Forest, is known for holding the record as the most haunted location in the UK. A solo camper from the popular YouTube channel Camper Vibes is about to find out why. She arrived at Daring Wood looking for peace and solitude, hoping to escape her hectic life. Upon her arrival, she set up camp, noticing the thick silence surrounding the forest. Usually, she wasn't bothered by camping alone, but this time, a faint sense of unease settled over her that she couldn't shake. As night fell, Sarah began to explore her surroundings. At first, she heard faint whispers in the wind, so soft they almost seemed imagined, but she pushed the thought aside. After having dinner, she prepared for bed. But at 2 a.m., things started to take a terrifying turn. She began hearing strange sounds, which she feared could be footsteps. Not long after, she became sure that there were other people outside her tent, a realization that sent chills down her spine. What was that? I don't want to turn the light on, but I'm pretty sure there's someone, or more, out there, she muttered, panic rising in her voice. I've never been so desperate for daylight. As the night dragged on, Sarah could barely sleep, convinced that something had disturbed the local wildlife. As dawn finally broke, Sarah emerged from the woods, shaky and breathless. She reached her car, feeling the safety of the modern world contrast sharply with the terrifying night she had just survived. The cabin was nestled deep within the forest, far from any nearby town. I had rented it for a week, hoping to get away from everything and find some peace. The first few days were serene. I spent my time reading, hiking, and soaking in the silence. The only sounds were the rustle of leaves and the occasional chirp of birds. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and darkness settled over the woods, I decided to light a fire in the old stone fireplace. The warmth and gentle crackling of the flames were comforting. I eased into a worn leather armchair, feeling the stress of city life slowly melt away. Later that night, I woke suddenly. The cabin was enveloped in complete darkness, the kind of blackness only found deep in the wilderness. I reached for my phone to check the time, but the battery was dead. Everything was silent, except for the occasional creaks and groans of the cabin's old wooden frame. I assured myself it was just the building settling and tried to fall back asleep. The following night, the same thing happened. I awoke in the dead of night, an unsettling feeling in my chest. This time, I thought I heard something outside. I lay still, listening carefully. There it was again, a faint rustling, like someone or something moving through the underbrush. I got up, grabbed a flashlight, and shone it out the window. The beam sliced through the darkness, but I saw nothing out of place. Over the next few days, the sense of being watched grew more intense. Though I tried to enjoy the trip, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. On the fourth night, the noises outside became clearer. Footsteps crunched through the leaves, stopping just outside the cabin's door. I spent the whole night wide awake, gripping the flashlight tightly and staring at the door until the first rays of morning. That was enough. The next morning, I decided to cut my trip short. I hurriedly packed my things, a sense of urgency pressing on me. As I loaded my car, I noticed footprints in the dirt around the cabin. They definitely weren't mine. The hair on my neck stood up. I tossed the rest of my gear into the car and drove away without a second glance. When I reached the edge of the forest and saw the paved road, a wave of relief washed over me. I never figured out who or what was lurking in the woods, but I didn't care. I was just glad to leave. I realized then that the tranquility I had been searching for sometimes comes at a cost. The forest kept its own secrets, and I was fortunate to escape unharmed. As I drove away, a mix of fear and relief filled me. The cabin, for all its rustic charm, hadn't given me the peaceful retreat I'd imagined. Instead, the experience made me appreciate the safety and familiarity of city life. The adventure had been real, but I was thankful to be going home. That evening, as I unpacked my bags, something strange caught my attention. In the pocket of my jacket, there was a small, dirty scrap of paper. My hands shook as I unfolded it. In a messy, shaky script, the words, "I saw you," were scrawled. A chill crawled up my spine. My mind raced, trying to figure out how it had gotten there. But I had no answers. The realization hit me hard. Whoever or whatever had been in those woods had been much closer than I had thought. I tried to shake the fear off, but as I looked around my familiar apartment, the comfort I usually felt was replaced by a cold dread. That night, I locked every door and window, but sleep remained elusive. The forest was behind me, but its secrets seemed to follow. The peace I'd sought was gone, replaced by a single haunting question. Who had been watching me, and would they try to find me again? I decided to go for a solo walk in the woods to clear my thoughts. It was a warm afternoon, and the sunlight filtered through the branches, casting patterns on the ground. At first, the trail was easy to follow, taking me further into the forest. I felt at peace, surrounded by the sounds of birds singing and leaves rustling in the breeze. As I ventured deeper, the path became harder to see. The trees grew more closely packed, and thick bushes blocked my way. I glanced at my phone, but there was no signal. I had made a few wrong turns, but I was sure I could find my way back. I pressed on, the sound of leaves crunching underfoot. After about an hour, I realized I was lost. The forest seemed endless, and everything looked the same. My heart started to race as fear took hold. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. I remembered reading survival tips about getting through the woods. I decided to retrace my steps, following my own tracks as best I could. The sun started to set, and shadows stretched across the forest floor. The darkening woods made me stumble over roots and branches, my fear growing with every minute. The cheerful bird songs had faded, replaced by the eerie calls of nighttime creatures. I wished I had packed a flashlight and more water. Wandering without direction, I finally saw a small clearing up ahead. Relief washed over me when I spotted an old, broken-down hut. I rushed toward it, hoping for help or at least a safe place to rest. The hut was empty, but it offered shelter for the night. Searching my backpack, I found a granola bar and a little water. It wasn't much, but it would have to be enough. I spent a restless night in the hut, listening to the strange sounds outside. Sleep was hard to come by, but at last, the first light of dawn filled me with hope. Determined to get back, I set out again. In the daylight, I noticed the trail signs I had missed before. Hours passed, and my legs felt heavy with exhaustion. But finally, I recognized some familiar spots. The trees began to thin, and I spotted the parking lot in the distance. A wave of relief crashed over me as I reached my car. I had never been so glad to see it. I paused for a moment, catching my breath and reflecting on the experience. I learned a tough lesson that day about the importance of preparation and respect for nature. The forest was beautiful but demanded caution. As I drove away, I felt thankful for the lessons it taught me. I knew I'd return someday, better equipped for the adventure. Just as I glanced in the rearview mirror, something sent a chill down my spine. Standing at the forest's edge was a figure, watching me. It was too far away to make out clearly, but I could feel its presence. I pressed on the gas, eager to put as much distance as possible between me and those woods. That night, the feeling of being watched wouldn't leave me. Every noise and shadow in my home seemed louder and darker. I lay awake, replaying the day's events in my mind. Just as I started to drift off, a faint rustling sound came from outside my window. My heart pounded as I forced myself to look. There, at the edge of my yard, barely visible in the darkness, stood the same figure. I never went back to those woods. I always had a deep love for the woods, the towering trees, the melodies of birds, and the rustling leaves. It felt like a calm place where my thoughts were clear. One weekend, I chose to go camping alone to ease my mind. I packed a tent, some food, and a flashlight and left early in the morning. The hike to my usual spot was peaceful and pleasant. Sunlight filtered through the branches, casting long shadows on the forest floor. As I walked further in, the noise of the town disappeared, replaced by the quiet sounds of nature. I found a small clearing beside a trickling brook and set up my tent. After a quick meal, I decided to explore the surroundings. Something about the woods felt different this time. The trees seemed taller, their branches more gnarled. I noticed a thin, nearly hidden trail, and curiosity urged me to follow it. The path led me deeper into the woods, where the light dimmed and the air turned chilly. A feeling of unease settled over me as the usual sounds of the forest faded, replaced by an eerie silence. I stumbled across an old, abandoned shack, partly covered by tangled vines. It looked like no one had been there for decades. Carefully, I stepped closer. The wooden door creaked as I pushed it open. Inside, the air was damp and stale, filled with the scent of rot and mildew. Broken furniture and shredded clothing were scattered on the dusty floor. Suddenly, a noise outside made me freeze. The unmistakable crunch of footsteps on dry leaves sent my heart racing. I crept to the window and peeked out, but I saw no one. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I knew it was time to go. As I stepped out, I heard the sound again, even closer this time. My instincts told me to run, but I forced myself to stay calm and retrace my way back to camp. The forest now seemed darker, and every rustle or snapping twig echoed in the silence. I moved as quickly as I could without breaking into a sprint. After what felt like forever, I finally saw the familiar clearing with my tent. Relief washed over me, but I didn't feel safe yet. I hastily packed my gear, eager to leave before nightfall. As I hiked back to the trailhead, the heavy feeling gradually disappeared. the forest began to feel normal again, filled with the songs of birds and the hum of insects. By the time I reached my car, the sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the trees. I drove away, the sense of unease lingering but fading with each mile. Later, sitting safely in my living room, I reflected on what had happened. Maybe it was just my imagination, or maybe the woods held secrets I wasn't meant to find. I knew I'd return someday, drawn by the beauty and mystery of the forest. But next time, I'd be more careful, more aware of the fine line between curiosity and safety. A few days later, I went back to the woods, this time with a friend. We followed the same path, and I showed him where I'd seen the shack. But when we got there, the shack was gone. Not a single trace left. My friend laughed, saying I must have imagined it, but I knew what I had seen. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I woke up sweating, the image of the shack vivid in my mind. As I lay in bed, I heard a faint creaking sound, like an old wooden door opening. Forcing myself to check, I found everything normal. The next morning, I discovered strange footprints outside my window leading back toward the forest. They were large, unlike any animal tracks I recognized. A chill went through me as I realized whatever had been in that shack was now following me. I moved away from that town not long after, but I never forgot the feeling of being watched. Sometimes on quiet nights, I still hear that soft creaking sound, and I know that whatever it was, it hasn't forgotten me either. I'd always been drawn to the woods. It was my refuge, a place to clear my mind and breathe freely. But that evening, something felt different. The sun sank faster than usual, leaving me with just enough light to make my way back. I had wandered further than I intended, exploring unfamiliar paths and losing track of time. As I turned to head home, the air grew chilly, and the trees seemed to press closer. The usual sounds of birds and insects faded into an unsettling quiet. My footsteps echoed too loudly in the stillness. I picked up my pace, trying to shake the growing sense that someone, or something, was nearby. The trail I was on became unrecognizable. I tried retracing my steps, but every direction looked the same. A wave of panic hit me. I pulled out my phone, but there was no signal, and the battery was nearly dead. I cursed myself for not charging it before leaving. With no other choice, I kept moving, hoping I was heading the right way. The darkness was closing in quickly, and I knew I had to get out before it was pitch black. I stumbled over roots and tangled undergrowth, my heart pounding in my ears. After what seemed like an eternity, I noticed a faint light flickering through the trees. I pushed toward it, praying it meant safety. As I got closer, I saw a small clearing with an old cabin at its center. Relief flooded me. I knocked on the door, but there was no response. The place seemed deserted. At least it was shelter. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air was stale and everything was covered in dust, but it was better than the cold, dark forest. In a drawer, I found a box of matches and lit a candle. The tiny flame brought a bit of comfort. I sat on a wobbly chair, trying to calm my racing thoughts. How did I end up here? How would I get back? I must have dozed off because when I woke, sunlight was streaming through the cracked windows. Hope surged through me. Outside, I saw a path leading away from the cabin. It looked well-trodden, like others had used it often. I followed it, and after what felt like an hour, I emerged at the edge of the woods. The familiar sight of the road back to town was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. My legs trembled with relief as I hurried toward it. When I finally got home, I was drained but safe. The forest had shown me a darker side, but I'd made it through. I knew I'd return one day, but next time I'd be more careful and better prepared. The woods were still my escape, but now I respected them more than ever. A few days later, my curiosity got the best of me. I searched for information about the cabin online. What I found chilled me to the bone. The cabin had once been a hideout for a serial killer in the 1980s, someone who was never caught. There were stories of strange sightings and unexplained disappearances in that area. My blood froze as I realized how close I'd come to real danger. That night, lying in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The darkness in my room felt heavier, the shadows shifting in unnatural ways. Then I heard it, a faint creak, like an old wooden door slowly opening. My heart pounded. I knew I had locked the doors, but I couldn't shake the fear that something, or someone, had followed me. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I set up my tent in a small clearing I had chosen for my solo camping trip. The forest surrounding me was still and quiet, the kind of silence that makes you feel truly alone, yet strangely observed. I had driven to this remote area to escape the constant buzz of city life and find some peace. After a simple meal of canned soup and bread, I decided to turn in early. The woods were shrouded in darkness, with just a faint glow from the moon filtering through the branches. I crawled into my sleeping bag, the crisp night air whispering through the tent's mesh windows. As I started to drift off, the familiar sounds of the forest soothed me. Crickets chirping, leaves rustling gently, and the occasional hoot of an owl. Somewhere in the middle of the night, I woke up abruptly. My heart was pounding, though I couldn't figure out why. I stayed completely still, straining my ears for anything unusual. At first, there was nothing but the usual forest sounds. Then I heard it, a faint rustling not far from the tent. I tried to convince myself it was just a small animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer, but the sound grew louder, and I realized I was hearing heavy footsteps. These weren't the quick, light movements of a wild animal. They were slow, deliberate steps. I held my breath, my body rigid with fear. My mind raced, remembering all the unsettling stories I'd heard about people meeting strangers in the woods. The footsteps stopped right outside my tent. My heart thudded so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest. My breaths were shallow and rapid. Then I heard the tent's zipper begin to move. I froze, fear rooting me in place. The flap opened gradually, and a shadowy figure appeared. My mind blanked out and instinct took over. I grabbed the small flashlight beside me and flicked it on, aiming the beam at the figure's face. It was a man, scruffy, disheveled, with wild eyes that glared back at me in the light. "What do you want?" I demanded, my voice trembling. He said nothing, just stood there with a mixture of confusion and menace on his face. Desperate, I snatched up my whistle and blew it as hard as I could. The piercing sound shattered the night's silence, startling the man. He backed away, muttering something incomprehensible, then turned and vanished into the shadows. I didn't sleep again that night. I sat up, flashlight and whistle clutched tightly, waiting for his return. But the footsteps never came back. When dawn finally broke, I packed up my things as quickly as I could, constantly glancing over my shoulder. I didn't breathe easy until I was in my car, driving away from that eerie place. The experience rattled me deeply. It taught me the importance of being prepared and staying vigilant. I never camped alone after that, always choosing busy campsites. That night could have ended much worse, but I was lucky. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, hidden in the trees. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those wild eyes staring back. Even now, safe at home, I can't escape the sense of being watched. The memory of those footsteps follows me into my dreams. I know I got away that night, but a part of me wonders if he's still out there, waiting for someone else. One weekend, I decided to go on a solo camping trip. I needed to escape the hustle and bustle, so I gathered my gear and drove to a peaceful area in the hills. The drive took a while, but the scenery was beautiful. Tall pines, a bright sky, and the sound of chirping birds made me feel at ease. I found a nice spot beside a gentle creek, pitched my tent, and built a small fire. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I cooked a simple dinner and soaked in the silence. Once it was fully dark, I decided to sleep. Around midnight, I was startled awake by an odd noise just outside my tent. It sounded like slow, deliberate footsteps. I tried convincing myself it was a wild animal, but these steps were too heavy and too measured. My heart pounded as I lay perfectly still, straining to listen. The footsteps grew closer, circling the tent. I held my breath, hoping whoever or whatever it was would lose interest. After a few tense moments, the noise stopped. I waited silently, and everything fell still again. Eventually, I drifted back to sleep, though my nerves were still on edge. When morning came, I stepped out of my tent and noticed large footprints around the campsite. They resembled human tracks, only bigger than any I'd seen before. A wave of unease washed over me, but I knew I had to stay calm. I quickly packed up my things, deciding it was time to leave. As I made my way to the car, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. Every rustle in the bushes made me flinch. I tried to focus on the trail and control my rising fear. When I finally reached my car, relief flooded over me. I started the engine and drove away, but the unsettling feeling lingered. I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, expecting to see someone behind me. The road was empty, but I couldn't relax until I was home. Once inside, I locked all the doors and windows, finally feeling secure for the first time in hours. The experience haunted me for weeks. I couldn't explain the strange footprints or the sensation of being watched. One thing I learned: sometimes you have to trust your instincts. Nature isn't always as peaceful as it seems. Now, I never go camping alone. I always bring friends and stick to familiar places. That trip taught me to respect the wilderness and the mysteries it holds. But even now, when I'm in bed at night, I sometimes hear those same footsteps circling my tent in my mind. And every now and then, I wake up feeling like unseen eyes are watching me from the shadows of my own room. I may never know what was out there, but I'm sure of one thing: it knows where I am. It was the beginning of summer when I decided to go on a solo road trip in my camper van. I needed to get away from the city and thought some time alone in nature would do me good. I packed my things, filled up the gas tank, and set off, excited for some peace and quiet. The first few days were amazing. I explored little towns, enjoyed scenic routes, and camped in beautiful places each night. On the fourth day, I ended up in a secluded area surrounded by thick forest. The isolation was exactly what I had been craving. That evening, I parked my van in a small clearing near a tranquil lake. The water was still, mirroring the colors of the setting sun. I made a simple meal, watched the stars appear in the sky, and felt completely relaxed. Before going to sleep, I made sure the doors were locked and the windows were closed tight. I felt secure inside my little van. In the middle of the night, I suddenly woke up to a strange noise. It sounded like footsteps circling my van. My heart pounded as I listened carefully. The steps were slow and deliberate, moving around me. I stayed still, barely daring to breathe, trying to hear more. After a few minutes, the sound stopped. I told myself it must have been an animal and tried to sleep again. But the silence didn't last. A faint tapping on the driver's side window startled me awake. My stomach clenched with fear as the tapping grew louder and more persistent. Summoning my courage, I peeked through the curtain, but saw nothing. The minutes dragged on as the tapping continued. I didn't dare move, terrified of making a sound. Without warning, the van shook violently, like someone was trying to force the door open. Panic took hold of me. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, whispering my location and what was happening to the operator. She told me help was on the way, but it would take time because of how remote the area was. She stayed on the line, trying to keep me calm. Meanwhile, the shaking and tapping stopped, replaced by a chilling silence. I felt trapped, too afraid to move. Eventually, I heard sirens in the distance. Relief washed over me as the sound grew nearer. When the police arrived, they found nothing around the van except some footprints. Whoever or whatever had been there was gone. The officers stayed with me until sunrise, helped me pack up, and advised me to camp somewhere safer. I decided to cut my trip short and head back home. The peace and solitude I had wanted were now shattered by fear. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. Every rustling leaf or snapping twig made my heart race. When I finally got back to the safety of the city, I let out a breath of relief. But that night, as I lay in my bed, I heard the same slow, deliberate footsteps outside my window. My heart froze. The city lights brought no comfort. Whatever had followed me in the woods was still there, haunting me.